Thank you very much, Mr. Tavares. The next point of our agenda are statements of the Council and the European Commission concerning the current situation in Cyprus. Before I give the floor to Minister Creighton on behalf of the Council, I would like to request all of you to respect the times allocated because we have delayed, and at 11:30 we have to begin our votes, and then we will have the meeting, the official meeting. I would like to ask Mrs. Creighton, on behalf of the Council, take the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Honourable members, the agreement of a Cypriot macroeconomic adjustment programme has been the focus of much energy and attention over recent weeks. I feel it important at the outset again to recall that I am here as a representative of the Council, and I am happy to be here in that capacity to discuss this matter. However, the discussions surrounding Cyprus were not conducted under the stewardship of the Irish Presidency, but rather under the stewardship of the President of the Eurogroup, and so, as I do not speak for the Eurogroup, I am clearly somewhat constrained in the contribution that I can make to this important debate. I think there is very little, if any, disagreement but that the situation in Cyprus is extremely regrettable, and the human consequences of it for the Cypriot people are the most regrettable elements of all. It is important to emphasise and for us to note, I think, that the situation in Cyprus was and is exceptional. A combination of a number of factors, including the size of the financial sector, the nature of risks assumed and other issues, including supervision issues, left the country particularly vulnerable to financial market turbulence. When two of Cyprus' largest banks ran into trouble, the cost of recapitalising them was such that Cyprus was left with little alternative but to seek assistance from other euro area member states. To resolve an exceptional situation, country-specific measures for a macroeconomic adjustment programme were agreed by the Troika and the Cypriot authorities, and subsequently by the Eurogroup. I do not intend to comment in depth on those measures, but elements of the programme include a restructuring of the banking sector, an audit of the anti-money laundering framework, fiscal consolidation and economic restructuring. On the basis of the programme, the euro area agreed in principle to provide an amount of up to €10 billion in financial assistance to Cyprus, subject to the IMF's contribution. The Eurogroup has since been able to welcome a staff-level agreement between Cyprus and the representatives of the Troika institutions on the policy conditionality underlying the macroeconomic adjustment programme. National procedures required for the approval of the European Stability Mechanism financial assistance can now be launched. I understand that what is now envisaged is that a final agreement by the ESM Board of Governors should be reached by the end of April, and that the first ESM disbursement is scheduled for mid-May. Mr. President, clearly the road ahead for Cyprus will be very challenging, but this should not prevent us recognising that these measures, however difficult, grant real assistance to Cyprus, assistance which is absolutely necessary, both to allow Cyprus the chance to get its public finances and economy back on a sustainable path, but also to safeguard stability inside the monetary union. This is both in the Cypriot and in the European interest. While the news in recent weeks may have been of Cyprus, it is true to say that the wider difficulties we have faced in a number of euro area countries have taken place against a backdrop in which financial turmoil has exposed significant weaknesses in our monetary union. As Presidency, as you know, our focus has been in advancing the measures which are designed to redress these shortcomings. This effort goes to the heart of the Union's effort to restore stability. Above all, this has meant working on banking union, work in which we would want again to acknowledge the central role and constructive engagement of the European Parliament. In adopting that focus, our Presidency has followed the lines of the priorities outlined by the European Council. Banking union is important because it will reinforce confidence in Europe's banking system and, indeed, its supervision. It will also help to break the link between sovereigns and banks and to foster the reintegration of financial markets. During the Irish Presidency, good progress has been made on the banking union dossiers. To date, the Capital Requirements Directive CRD4 proposal has been finalised and the agreement on the single supervisory mechanism is currently being finalised. Political agreement on the SSM was reached at the informal ECOFIN Council in Dublin last week, where ministers also reaffirmed their commitment to the urgent completion of all of the agreed elements of banking union, and this will continue as a major priority for us in the weeks and months ahead. The setting up of the supervisor will also pave the way for the European Stability Mechanism to take on the direct recapitalisation of banks. The remaining elements of the banking union package include the bank recovery and resolution proposal, consideration of which has been accelerated by the Irish Presidency to meet the deadline of June, which was set by the European Council for its agreement with the European Parliament. Bank recovery and resolution will lay the foundation for a single resolution mechanism, a detailed proposal on which we expect to see published by the Commission very shortly. Thank you very much.
Minister Creighton, and now on behalf of the European Commission, Vice President Rehn has the floor.
Madam President, honourable members, as President Barroso is attending the funeral of Baroness Thatcher today, I am presenting the Commission's views in this important debate together with my colleagues Joaquin Almunia and Michel Barnier, with whom we have worked very closely as a team over the past years. We are about to finalise a support programme for Cyprus. It will enable Cyprus to avoid a disorderly default with all its dramatic ramifications for the Cypriot people. This marks the beginning of a joint effort to bring Cyprus onto the path of sustainable growth and job creation. The process that led us to this agreement has indeed been very difficult and not without mistakes. The Cypriot authorities, the Member States and the European institutions had to find unique solutions to exceptional problems. They had to do so without previously tested instruments and in the final stages of negotiations under enormous time pressure. Thus, there are at least two key lessons to be learned from this difficult process. First, there must be absolute clarity about secured deposits. In this respect, the Eurogroup and Cyprus took rapid corrective action and underlined that secured deposits indeed are secured in Europe. Second, the developments in Cyprus demonstrate the reasons why a banking union is a necessary element of a true economic and monetary union. We need a well-functioning single supervisory mechanism with a single rule book to prevent the emergence of an unsustainable banking sector like in Cyprus. And we must ensure that even if the reinforced supervision fails, we have a single resolution mechanism to provide the instruments for a timely and effective restructuring and resolution of the problem banks. But these instruments are not yet there, and in this process we have to work with the less sufficient ones that we have today. The problems of Cyprus were built over many years. At their heart was an oversized banking sector that thrived on attracting foreign deposits with very favourable conditions. These capital inflows also contributed to a property boom and the accumulation of external imbalances. In fact, the depth of banking problems stemmed from the poor practices of risk management. Lacking adequate oversight, the two largest Cypriot banks were allowed to build up by far too concentrated risk exposures, which was, in fact, these problems in the banks that caused the troubles for the sovereign and the economic decline of Cyprus, not the other way around. In November 2011, the Commission communicated to the Cypriot authorities that a financial assistance programme would be unavoidable unless the persistent economic problems were immediately addressed. Eventually, Cyprus asked for financial assistance, but only in June 2012. After half a year of talks, a staff-level agreement on the necessary structural reforms and fiscal measures were reached. Many of them, including anti-money laundering measures, were adopted by the Cypriot Parliament before the end of 2012. President, honourable members, the Commission's goal during the whole process of agreeing a support programme for Cyprus was threefold: to help Cyprus to the path of sustainable growth, to preserve financial stability in Cyprus and in the Eurozone, and to protect the integrity of the euro and the single market. The Commission's preferred scenario was a more gradual adjustment of the Cypriot banking system and real economy, while ensuring debt sustainability. However, there was a very firm financial constraint. The euro area member states were ready to commit official support up to €10 billion, whereas the total financing needs had been estimated at €17 billion, and this constraint severely limited the options available. As the time was running out, the scenario of the more gradual economic adjustment was not on the cards anymore, unfortunately. The state of banks deteriorated rapidly. Soon it became clear that the second biggest bank, Laiki, had to be resolved immediately. The risk of a complete collapse of the entire banking system and thus a sweeping loss of deposits and savings and a disorderly default of the sovereign was indeed very real. That would have been a disaster for Cyprus and for the Cypriots. Without a bank resolution law and without a programme in place, the Cypriot banks remained closed and the bank holidays were extended. The Cypriot authorities imposed capital controls to avoid the flight of deposits. The Commission, as the guardian of the treaties, is closely monitoring the impact of capital controls in Cyprus. The temporary restrictions were justified in the given circumstances, but they are a very serious limitation to the free movement of capital. Therefore, the Commission will ensure that these measures last no longer than strictly necessary. President, honourable members, the support programme will enable Cyprus to restore the health of the economy and to create a more sustainable economic model. I agree with the Finance Minister of Cyprus, Haris Georgiades, who said yesterday that he wants to shun the blame game and focus on the future. He said as follows: "We are determined to adopt and implement all those reform measures which we should have adopted a long time ago, but we failed to do so." Indeed, we now have to concentrate all our efforts to facilitate the emergence of new sources of economic activity and to alleviate the social consequences of the economic shock. To this effect, the Commission decided in March to set up a support group for Cyprus to assist it with the implementation of the adjustment programme. We are now mobilising our resources to provide technical assistance. The support group will rely on expertise from across the Commission services. The immediate priority is to identify the relevant resources available from the current structural funds. The Commission stands by the Cypriot people in these challenging times. We are committed to help Cyprus to get through the tough times and overcome the current difficulties. I trust that we can count on the support of the European Parliament in together mobilising the available resources for Cyprus as quickly and as effectively as possible. Madam President, I am looking forward to a forward-looking and constructive dialogue on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President Rehn. Περνάμε τώρα στους ομιλητές
Now we go to the speakers, speaking on behalf of the groups. First of all, I would like to ask Mr. Jean-Paul Gauzès, on behalf of the EPP, to take the floor for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. President of Council, Commissioner, the Cyprus situation is disastrous. Cyprus is on the brink of bankruptcy and the people are suffering. A European agreement on an adjustment programme for the economy of Cyprus has now been found. We need to implement it, and it's not straightforward. I think we should all be aware of the fact that there are consequences for the people of Cyprus, and these consequences are sizable. I don't want to speak about all the causes that led to the situation, but I would like to pick up on 2 points, if I may. First of all, there was insufficient vigilance on the part of EU institutions, unfortunately. There was no effective intervention in order to limit the risks that were foreseeable. There was an unbalanced economy, financial activities were out of control, and we're talking about 20 billion euros in terms of the economy of the island. That's 7 times its GDP just for those financial activities. There was no effective intervention in order to counter the decisions taken by the Cypriot government at the time. They were trying to conceal the real state of affairs, and therefore they were trying to turn to Russia to find financial support, and the situation got out of control. What this led to was an increase in risks, unreasonable increase in risks. Secondly, I would also mention that the Cyprus banks acted with several mistakes and took too many risks. They purchased so many Greek debts, for instance, at a time when everybody else was selling Greek debt. So I think we need to draw some lessons from this crisis. We need more solidarity. We need also institutionalised transfers. The European Union can't simply stand by and watch these specialisations, which really put a country into a perilous situation. Secondly, the EU intervention has to be carried out transparently, and it also needs to explain the situation. Decisions taken have to be explained to our EU citizens. Now, the collective behaviour of our ministers of finance, unfortunately, led to a real disaster, a fiasco, I would call it. I'm not calling into question the substance, but I think the way in which it was communicated was poor. The citizens saw this as a kind of hold-up, something that could have ramifications throughout the whole of Europe subsequently. How can you be credible under those circumstances? The Eurogroup announcement or communication was also very poor. I know it was urgent, but that's not an excuse. Therefore, we need to review our European economic policy. Our resolution system, banking resolution system, also need to be looked at very carefully. I know that Commissioner Barnier feels very strongly about this. The EU can no longer accept this. You have a disproportionate system. It is, of course, a considerable factor that leads to greater risk. I think that the events in Cyprus, after other events, go to prove that these systems are not viable in the long term. They are overinflated, and we therefore need to make sure that banks do not simply concentrate on one single sphere of activity, unless you have transfers, as you might have within a nation state. The European plan has stated that Cyprus needs to reduce its banking sector or its importance, which I think is a good thing. Also, structural reforms will be required in order to build a solid premise for the economy of the country and to return to growth in the country. In addition to that, we need to implement as soon as possible a banking union and a single supervisory mechanism. I think that the events in Cyprus have proven that we need to have influence on the part of the EU with regard to Eurozone banks. That is necessary if we want to avoid such crises in future. The Union should also resolve another issue, namely the tricky issue of financial regulation. Very often we'll find that these regulations deviate from the norm, from the standard, and it creates tax havens. We need harmonisation. We also need to act more swiftly. We need more Europe, a deeper Europe, a Europe of solidarity, but also, of course, a Europe that is under control. various measures have been set up, and Commissioner Rehn referred to these. We need to use these tools. We need to use them quickly, and we need to use them in a spirit of sound cooperation between member states. Our duty, first of all, is to re-establish confidence on the part of the Cyprus people. We need to show solidarity as European Union. We need to support the people of Cyprus, and incidentally, we believe that the new government will be in a position to set up new measures, necessary measures, in order to have recovery with sound public finances and financial stability. We trust them in doing that. Also, we need to make sure that these efforts are efficient, and of course, Commissioner, I would argue, Vice President, I would argue that it's very important for the Commission to use whatever means it has at its disposal under the current legal framework to come up with the measures and resources that will be helpful for Cyprus, particularly with regard to the budget. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, we do not have the possibility to accept any blue card because, as I recalled you, we have the meeting with the President of Ireland. We don't have the time. So I would like to ask Mr. Hannes Swoboda to take the floor for the Socialists.
President. Commissioner Vice President, you said mistakes have been made. Well, grave mistakes have been made. Mistakes which should never have been made. And I don't know about your personal role. There are many rumours, but this also shows the intransparency, the lack of transparency. But you should never have agreed to the attack on the deposits below the €100,000 limit. This is not acceptable. It has destroyed also confidence and trust in the promises of the European Union. And therefore I think we should change the whole structure of our policies and of the methods. As I said, Commission Vice President, yesterday, we may not like and we don't very often not agree with your policies, but you are democratically elected. You are responsible to this Parliament. The Troika is not. Stop the Troika. We don't need the Troika. That is not necessary. Do you know, Commission Vice President, the behaviour of the Troika? The rude behaviour of the Troika? Do you know how they treated the President, the elected President of Cyprus? Ask them and ask the Cypriot representatives. And the rude behaviour to the elected representatives and to the citizens of Cyprus and other countries is not acceptable. Let's stop the Troika. You and your colleagues are responsible. You are democratically legitimised. Yes, they are. And we want to speak with you about that. We don't need longer the IMF. Madame Lagarde says the one thing, the IMF representatives do anything else. You have to coordinate, of course, with the ECB, but we have to change. We also have to change our attitude in the Parliament. We should create a subgroup or subcommittee, whatever institutional framework we give it, for treating the euro case, because we need a real dialogue between the Commission, the Council and the Eurogroup, also with the Parliament, and we have to be ready for that dialogue. Thirdly, also the Council, I must really say, some members of the Council, like Mr. Schäuble, makes comments, these are comments of a neo-colonial behaviour from above to the citizen. This is not acceptable. And Mr. Schäuble should rather look that we get a real banking union. Mr. Schäuble should look that we get the single resolution mechanism. Already he makes difficulties. Already he says, well, we have to change perhaps the constitution. And already it is clear that there is no willingness, at least before the election, maybe after the election. But this is not acceptable. We need an efficient and viable banking union. And the last point, Cyprus has potentialities. Cyprus has good people, has people who want to go for innovation, who want to go for the diversification of the economy. And they will have income from gas and oil. Give them the time, give them the possibility to develop alternative economy. Yes, they need reducing the banking sector, they need diversification, but we are here to help them. We are here to help the Cypriot people and not to dominate them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Svoboda. The President of ALDE, Guy Verhofstadt.
Yeah, I think that everybody can accept that the way we handled the Cypriot crisis was a disaster the last months. It's not very serious, naturally, and very fair that we say that to you, Mr. Rehn, because it should be the Eurogroup who is sitting there. and who is hearing our assessment about how the Cyprus file has been handled. Because it has given the impression Europe is failing, but what is failing? It was in fact what is failing is a bad intergovernmental system that we have today, where 17 ministers of finance have to deal case by case with now Cyprus, previous Ireland, then Portugal, tomorrow maybe Spain or Italy. And how it works we know. They are waiting until the last moment. That's their first rule. The second is that they are meeting each other then at the end of the week, in the beginning of the weekend, under the pressure of the opening of the markets on Monday, and then they are taking a decision case by case under the pressure, thinking that they have solved the problem. And so I think that what we have seen in the case of Cyprus is proof of the fact that we need the fastest as possible concerning these problems a European resolution fund, a European mechanism, and not longer a case by case approach as we have seen today. And I should urge you, Mr Rehn, to come forward as fast as possible with a proposal. I know that Mr Barroso said to us that before June there should be a proposal on the table. Such a European resolution fund, it should be the banks who are paying contributions in relation to their risk profile. A saving bank less contribution, an investment bank with a higher risk, a higher contribution. But in any way it should be the end of a game that we are playing for the moment, in which in every interview we are saying who has to pay the bill? Are it the taxpayers? Are it the depositors? Are it the shareholders? Are it the bondholders? I think all these are bad solutions. The only good solution is the European Resolution Fund, where we make an insurance system with contributions by the financial sector itself. And my request to you, Mr Rehn, is that you speed up that proposal. Don't wait for the green light from Berlin and from Paris this time. Put it on the table the fastest as possible so that Parliament and Council can start. In the meanwhile, and that is my second point, I want to know what went wrong in this case of Cyprus. We have asked for hearings in the Econ. We shall organise that on the 25th of April, because there are a number of questions that have been answered today. Who proposed, in fact, this levy on small depositors? What was the baddest idea ever, I should say? Why did the President of the Eurogroup, Mr Dijsselbloem, say that the Cyprus crisis is systemic, but we have a European systemic risk board? What they did. If the crisis is systemic, then the ESRB should have done something. Otherwise, why we need an ESRB? Or what was the role of the Troika in the sale of the Cypriot banks? And then finally, that's for the ECB, difficult question, how this emergency liquidity assistance operate in the Cyprus issue, because that has been used 18 months ago already. So I think that we need these answers. We need to create transparency in what happened wrong. Lessons learned. That is absolutely necessary. And if there is no sufficient answer inside these hearings, inside the Econ Committee, my group will call for the immediate setting up of a parliamentary inquiry committee to shed light and find answers to these and other questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Verhofstadt. President Daniel Cohn-Bendit.
My dear colleagues, I'm not going to repeat what's been said by the previous speakers about the way the crisis is being managed, but there are some questions that are still open. 18 months. For 18 months now, we have known that the Cypriot crisis was on the way and that it would get worse and worse. 18 months. And for these 18 months, how much money has left Cyprus so that it can't be taken at the last minute? Now we've taken decisions at the last minute, and I'm sure that all these intelligent people who went to Cyprus so they wouldn't have to pay taxes have left it long times ago. What about the foreign banks with their branches in Cyprus, apart from the Cypriot banks? Because there's foreign banks as well in Cyprus. They are organising tax evasion, and not just in Cyprus, too, across the planet. What about them? Well, we want a new model in Europe. Too big to fail? Now it's too small to bail. That's where we've got to. And, let's get sensible. Let's stop saying sustainable economic perspective. If you want to talk about that, I'm not as... There's not just one prospect for Cyprus, there are others. There's always more than one. But for all of Europe. But the prospect for Cyprus is unification of the island. That's an economic project. So that would open up to investors to invest in the most dynamic economy in the region. And what is that? Turkey. Turkish entrepreneurs will only invest in Cyprus if you reunify it. So that's what you need. If you want a good economy, they've got to reunify the island. That's the first thing. And with integration and incorporation into the European Union. And the second thing, as we said earlier, whether we like it, we don't like it because we're environmentalists, but the prospect, the first economic prospect for Cyprus is oil and gas. It's obvious. So who and how can we help them? You've got tourism, you've got oil, you've got gas. These are awkward times. These are contradictory things. You need to unify the island. You need to get to a point where, because our negotiations with Turkey are progressing, the Turks, once again, are feeling that they're being drawn in by Europe. And they're much more than the Russians. They are going to be interested in investing in Cyprus. So all of that is just to say one thing. All of us here must understand that the prospect, the future for Cyprus is a future that means that we must look at our relations with Turkey in a new light as well. It's not an ideological problem. It's a problem of the future prospects of a whole area of Europe. It's true of the Cypriot economy and the Greek economy. Two, the Greek economy will not recover unless it's incorporated into the economic development of the whole region. And what is the region? What is the big economic powerhouse in the region that can help us here? It's Turkey. So what have we got to do? We've all got to get together and go a lot further, not just talk about what is necessary in terms of a new way of managing our banks. There's more to it than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cohn-Bendit. Mr. Zahradil, Vice President of the ECR, has the floor.
Zemí eurozóny, která se ocitla v problémech.
Thank you very much. Cyprus is a country in the eurozone that has got itself into problems, but I don't think it's going to be the last country that finds itself in a difficult situation. The country itself shows up a very specific situation, but it does show that there are very different reasons for these crises in the different countries, and I think this is why we need to come up with a different recipe, as it were, by way of a solution. And if you take a look at the response of the European Union, it's not diversified, it's more general, and that's because we are operating within the eurozone. So there's massive financial assistance, a very high volume of financial resources, and then there are certain other fiscal restrictions and all sorts of measures, including regulatory measures across the European Union, including a proposal for a banking union. Now, we know there was a rather unfortunate measure in Cyprus, and that was that part of the private savings in the private banks were seized, and that is totally unacceptable. And I think all of us would agree with that. The Eurozone itself is not stable, and if we take a look at the various elements of instability, they're actually anchored in the Eurozone. And when difficult times come along, then the problems rear their head. So we have, it's not a sort of cyclical form of financial crisis that comes and goes. We've got a more serious problem with the actual structure of the Eurozone, the system. And I think we're going to be seeing that more countries, new countries, are going to find themselves in problems. That we may have more bailouts. Cyprus is a small country, but what would happen if large countries were to face the same kind of problems? We've got Spain and Italy. What are we going to do in the case of those countries if they need help? Where are we going to get the money from? because the Eurozone itself does not have that much in the way of financial resources available. And Cyprus is almost being used as an excuse to attack the fiscal autonomy of the member states. And in order to come up with a European solution to these kind of problems, then the individual rights of member states to have their own tax policy is being undermined, and that is totally unacceptable. Tax competition is one of the core elements of the European Monetary Union.
Mr. Farage has the floor.
Years ago, Mrs Thatcher recognised the truth behind the European project. She saw that it was about taking away democracy from nation states and handing that power to largely unaccountable people. Knowing as she did that the euro would not work, she saw that this was a very dangerous design. Now, we in UKIP take that same view, and I have tried over the years in this Parliament to predict what the next moves would be as the euro disaster unfolded. But not even me in my most pessimistic of speeches would have imagined, Mr Rehn, that you and the others in the Troika would resort to the level of common criminals and steal money from people's bank accounts in order to keep propped up this total failure that is the euro. You even tried to take money away from the small investors in direct breach of the promise you made back in 2008. Well, the precedent has been set. And if we look at countries like Spain, where business bankruptcies are up 45% year on year, we can see what your plan is to deal with the other bailouts as they come. I must say, the message this sends out to investors is very loud and clear. Get your money out of the Eurozone before they come for you. What you have done in Cyprus is you have actually sounded the death knell of the euro. Nobody in the international community will have confidence in leaving their money there. And how ironic to see the Russian Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, compare your actions and say, I can only compare it to some of the decisions taken by the Soviet authorities. And then we have a new German proposal that says that actually what we ought to do is confiscate some of the value of people's properties in the southern Mediterranean Eurozone states. This European Union is the new communism. It is power without limits. It is creating a tide of human misery, and the sooner it is swept away, the better. And what of this place? What of the Parliament? This Parliament has the ability to hold the Commission to account. I have put down a motion of censure debate on the table. I wonder whether any of you have the courage to recognise it and to support it. I very much doubt that, and I'm minded that there's a new Mrs Thatcher in Europe, and he's called Fritz Bolkestein, and he has said of this Parliament, remember he's a former commissioner, it is not representative anymore. For the Dutch or European citizen, the European Parliament is living out a federal fantasy which is no longer sustainable. How right he is.
Thank you, Mr. Farage. Our colleague, Mr. Hadjigeorgiou, on behalf of GUE. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank the speakers who supported Cyprus. Most of them supported Cyprus. I would like to say that, according to my view, we are playing in a play. The representatives of the Parliament, especially the members of the EPP, support us, but when they are in government they do the opposite. Mr. Daul said here yesterday that we should neutralise the debt in Europe. But what do the representatives of the EPP do in their governments when they took the decisions in the Eurogroup to do a haircut to Cypriot deposits? What they did was exactly the opposite. Here we shouldn't pretend we support Cyprus and then when in government to do the opposite. And I think that the representatives of the Commission, with all due respect, they're also playing a role. They are not listening to what the representatives of the citizens say in the Parliament. What they're doing is they're waiting for time to pass to say some prepared answers and to go to their offices and decide something different from what the representatives of the citizens say. European citizens have seen a big haircut in their deposits, and at the same time we had a similar haircut of democracy in Europe. And Cyprus, as soon as Cyprus stands on its 2 feet, it will examine the possibility to say the big goodbye, not counting the consequences, because this will express dignity. Because when Cyprus was going through difficult times, there was no solidarity. Solidarity was the solidarity of the lion in the forest. Solidarity towards smaller creatures of the forest. Would the Eurogroup do that vis-à-vis a bigger state? Why didn't it do it for Greece? Greece was also a small state. Can it do the same for Italy? Can it do the same for Spain? Can it do the same for France, for Germany? Never, never. They did it because Cyprus is a small country. This solidarity is the one that we know. For the European Central Bank and its supervision, the famous supervision. Where was that supervision when the Bank Laiki was expanded and went to Greece? Why they giving loans or credits? Where was that supervision? It left this expansion to happen and it not examine a haircut of deposits in Greece. I'm not for a haircut, but because in that case it created a systemic risk. That proves that it was done exactly because Cyprus was considered a small country. I'm ending my speech. Until the end of 2011, we had a public debt compared to its GDP below the average of the Eurozone. 77% Cyprus, 88% the Eurozone. And this is a proof that the Cypriot economy was following a correct course. Just a bunch of bankers created the problems and the lack of supervision from the central bank. Thank you. Our colleague Stassen from the non-attached.
Thank you. The crisis in Cyprus is showing once again just what a mess the euro is. It's appalling. Europe stumbles from one crisis to the next, one bailout to the next, and it just gets worse and worse. Cyprus is number 5 in just 3 years. The European Union just keeps on muddling along and everything collapses. The faith in Europe collapses. And this shows just how bad it is for people now. The Euro group has now not satisfied with destroying people's currency. It's now destroyed their faith in their bank deposits and their savings. What is happening in Cyprus? Everyone in Europe thinks that it'll be our turn next. So, of course, there are going to be new bailouts needed, but we don't know when. We need an extra 6 billion euros for Cyprus, and Slovenia looks like the next candidate for a bailout. There is just no end to the misery of the euro. The European Union has simply called down a crisis on the whole of Europe with the euro, and it is now seeing its effect on the world economy. 3.3% growth, great news, yes, but not in the eurozone. We have no growth. We have economic shrinkage in the Eurozone. It's time to end with the euro. The only way to tackle the euro crisis is for the European leaders to recognise that it's the euro that's the problem, not the solution. So people must be allowed to go back to their own currency and devalue. That's the only way out for Cyprus, otherwise it's never going to end. The Dutch should not be sending any more of their money. Let's get Europe out of the hands of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. We go to the other speakers, and please maintain the time limit. First of all, I would like to give the floor to our colleague Mrs. Theocharous for 2 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chairman, Minister. Commissioner, the financial situation in Cyprus is tragic indeed, and the Cypriot society is very unhappy with the European Union because the community solidarity finally was not implemented. However, Cyprus is looking towards the European Parliament, and that's why we should hope what is rule of law and what are the principles and values on which the European Union is based. Colleagues, the democracy of Cyprus has some inherent problems from the time it was created, and these were worsened with the Turkish invasion of 1974. I would like to recall that in 1974 Cyprus lost 40% of its land, of its territory, 55% of its coastline, and 90% of its tourism basis. It's this very big valley, and 40% of its populations became refugees, and they live in various camps, refugee camps. You haven't seen the best service and the best investment, Mr. Cohn-Bendit, that Turkey can give to Cyprus is to leave. Turkey should leave. So don't won't ask us to exchange the Troika, the occupation of the Troika with the occupation of Turkey. Unless you are trying to push the adhesion of Turkey. That's why you should allow Turkey to invest in your big economies. We know what Turkey is, and we do not want Turkey to save us. Colleagues, after the invasion, the Cypriot economy grew based on two pillars, tourism and the financial sector. We do not have a heavy industry. We do not have land to develop agriculture. The tourism, because being neighbouring with various zones in war, was hit many times during the 25 years. And many times there was a note announced saying that Cyprus was dangerous because it was near the Middle East where there was conflict. Today, with the Eurogroup decisions, our financial sector also received a fatal blow. Many mistakes were made, okay, and maybe we didn't see some things in order to avoid the crisis, and the reforms that were necessary were not made. On the other case, the recipe implemented here, the shock therapy implemented, doesn't have sure result. It's as if we are guinea pigs, and the behaviour of the Troika vis-à-vis the Cypriot population is unacceptable. Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Rehn, do you know that the European Union has made serious mistakes in handling the problem of Cyprus? Mr. Draghi gave liquidity 10 billion to the bank, Laiki Bank, without controls, an amount that should be recovered by the bank. It shouldn't be given to be paid by the depositors. The market does not work. The citizens are not paid. The healthy businesses are closing, and the trust towards the financial system of Cyprus is being lost. As also many jobs, thousands of jobs are lost. Please, could you round up? Thank you very much. Mrs. Ferreira, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam President. It took a day. It took a day to destroy confidence, and it's going to take an awful lot longer to try and re-establish that confidence. Apparently, nobody got away scot-free. Where were people? Where was the Commission when it came to this levy, the levy concerning the 100,000 amount? Who took responsibility for that measure? I think that we need to have single responsibility. I think that process needs to be accelerated. I also believe that we need to re-establish sound financial health for our banks. We also need to work on deposits, the deposit guarantee scheme, but also, of course, the whole situation for deposits or savings below 100,000. I don't think it's fair for taxpayers to foot the bill or for savers, depositors to foot the bill. We need to have legislation on banking here in the EU. That process needs to be stepped up as well. And banks, of course, themselves must also contribute to the solution. Finally, I would argue that time has come now to say, enough is enough. There's been a lot of apathy vis-à-vis fraud and tax evasion. That needs to come to an end. I think we need to have fiscal coordination within the Eurozone.
Our colleague Sharon Bowles.
Thank you. Act in haste, repent at leisure applies to those Eurogroup cum Troika meetings where what seems to be decided is that there will be a decision, even if a bad one. That is the terrible template. Ever since the abortive first Cyprus package, when Europe's best stood ready to allow a raid on insured deposits, there have been many suggestions on how to levy more fairly on deposits, or even to apply a wealth tax, which has precedents for some burden sharing in difficult times, as long as not discriminatingly targeted on deposits. Retrospective interest taxes, putting some elements of deposits in escrow as an advance interest tax, and other such schemes could have raised funds from deposits without devastation, but you gave no time. Many of Europe's people now stand aghast at the final solution, where uninsured depositors have been treated differently, where businesses close and jobs are lost to protect taxpayers from sharing in losses of state-funded depositors. This does not make economic sense for future recovery, never mind a loss of moral compass, and anyway, something will have to be done. Finally, Cyprus teaches us that we need many clearer rules on bank resolution and hierarchy. But surely alarm bells should ring when liquidity operations for an individual institution become of the same order of magnitude as GDP. That is a recipe for moral hazard or behaviour more befitting of loan sharks. Defence is in transparency. People, investors need warning. Thank you.
Mr. Lamberts has the floor.
Thank you, President, and bravo, Sharon. I can support everything you've said. Commissioner Rehn, I'd like to address you specifically. A month before this famous weekend, though 17 billion were necessary in order to render Cypriot debt sustainable. Now we find out last week that it's 23 billion. Just a slight mistake, comma here or there. But those who carry out the forecasts and estimates for you, are they incompetent? I wouldn't really have thought so, because I would have thought they rather actually know their job. Or was it, well, we'll play around with the figures just to make sure that reality looks better than it really is? And just to allow certain people, and here I'm thinking of Germany, to actually get out of all of this without too many problems. You seem to have altered the figures on Greece, sustainability in Greece, and then Ecofin said, oh, maybe a mistake had been made when it came to estimates and forecasts for Greece. But I think it's your responsibility not to embellish the situation, the reality, so that Germany can get out of this unscathed. You are supposed to paint out reality as it is, and then it's up to the politicians to take their responsibilities. Thank you very much. Now, as you know, I'm very strict when it comes to timekeeping, because we are actually running over time now, so please help me here. Mr. Epping.
Let me say that I prefer a bail-in over a bail-out. The cost of saving banks should not be carried by taxpayers, but by stakeholders above deposit threshold of €100,000. Those who have a stake in a bank, hoping for profits in return, should also carry the burden when losses are made. These losses should not be socialised. Let me draw your attention also to another aspect, Mr. Commissioner. What are the conditions Cyprus has to meet for softening the terms of a loan of €2.5 billion it got from Russia? In the March issue of Jane's Defence Weekly, as we know, a reputable publication, it is reported that Russia is going to set up a navy task force in the Mediterranean. According to the Russian Ministry of Defence, the force will require shore facilities. It did not specify where. So therefore I ask the Commission to ask Cyprus whether any deals relating to these issues were made with Russia. Thank you, and I stayed within my speaking time, Mr. President.
Mr. Borghezio.
Thank you, President. In the media conference on April 4th, President Draghi was very annoyed about the the question whether this confiscation of accounts in Cyprus might become the model for all of Europe tomorrow. But in fact, the directive we are currently looking at sets out exactly what happened in Cyprus. And Mr. Draghi, it's no hazard that, he asked Parliament and Council to approve all this. So basically the directive sets out that in order to cancel out a debt that could cause a threat to the whole system, that has to be paid for, obviously, by the savers, and that's exactly what happened in Cyprus. Cyprus is a test, let's be clear about it, to understand what happens when you do this, when the super financial bureaucracy that governs us, what happens when they try to deal with serious problems. And the European Union, I'm coming to a conclusion, is getting ready to create union with a European Central Bank under the supervision of its creditors. This is not the way to do things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman, the banking sector in Cyprus is the basic economic sector for growth and for jobs. And after the haircut has been reduced by 50%, what would happen? Really, if with the decision of the European Union, the car industry in Germany saw a 50% reduction in sales, what will happen in France? If the agricultural production was reduced by 50%, what would happen in Holland? If the exports of the country were reduced by 50%, unfortunately, things for Cyprus are simple. There are no complications and hidden exits. With a very tricky solution, the Eurogroup has blown up one of the areas for the creation of salaries and for jobs in the Cypriot economy. And I would like to ask you, my dear colleagues, how sustainable can be a debt in a country that doesn't have the possibility to grow? Dear colleagues, if this destructive course is not reversed, this will not influence only the young unemployed and the medium stratum in Cyprus, but all the countries of second and third speed in the European Union. I'm asking the Council and the Commission, what are you going to propose in order to reverse the situation? What proposal are you going to make? Thank you.
Monsieur Le Pen.
President, ladies and gentlemen, the crisis in Cyprus has revealed the real face of technocratic Europe. The Commission, the ECB, the Eurogroup, within a matter of days, reached an agreement, and savers were penalised. They installed control on currencies for a sovereign state without even asking for their opinion. Mr. Draghi closed down the international banking transfer system between Cyprus and the rest of the world. This is an unprecedented move in Europe, because what we're really talking about here is killing off a sovereign state in economic terms, and from an international legal point of view it is an act of war. In order to keep Cyprus within the Eurozone, an unelected authority violated all European treaties, going against free trade, free movement, and it did so without any scruples whatsoever. What about the situation in Italy? What do we plan to do here? Put an end to democracy? In a way, what's happened here is an illustration of the absurdity of the European project. We're negating states and we're removing freedoms. Technocratic Europe is an act of tyranny, and it is also a system that will lead to the crushing of the peoples of Europe. And it is time for us to stop this. We now need a new spring, a spring for European peoples. We don't want a European Soviet Union.
Thank you. The economic difficulties that member states are facing in their attempts to consolidate public finances should not lead us to forget that the way out of this crisis is growth based on structural reform and targeted investment. In a crisis like this one, we should not forget either that one of the reasons behind the creation of Europe was solidarity between peoples, and I therefore think that the package for Cyprus is valid. It's a valid part of that. I hope that all the measures requested will be implemented effectively to ensure stability in the financial sector, and so that it can have the structural reform and balancing of the books so that the competitiveness of Cyprus is increased, and that way they will have long-term stable and sustainable growth. I would like to ask Mr. Rehn for further information on what the Commission actually intends to do to deal with Cyprus problems with reference to the future multiannual financial framework. For example, advance payment of the structural funds, or changing the co-funding rate, for example. There are many things that we're ruling out at the moment that could give some breathing space to that island's economy. We'd like to hear more about what Council thinks. I would like to express my trust in the new Cypriot government and the President, Mr. Anastasiades, to get the economy going again.
Mr. President, Cyprus applied to the European Stability Mechanism asking assistance because of the impairment of the Greek debt that cost Cyprus 4.5 billion, or 25% of its GDP. Instead of solidarity, Eurogroup punished Cyprus by destroying overnight its economic model. It imposed an unfair haircut, thus destroying prosperity and aspirations of Cypriots, spreading mistrust all over Europe. Eurogroup blackmailed Cyprus for either a bankruptcy or haircut. It gave no time for reforms to the new government. It forced another southern European country into Troika's arms and into a vicious circle of austerity, recession and unemployment. Whilst the European Parliament is excluded, Troika, with no democratic legitimacy, is called to rescue Cyprus by destroying its economy in order to save it. This is ironic. I strongly protest the unjust allegations against Cyprus and urge Eurogroup, the Commission and ECB to revoke their wrong decisions, to help Cyprus restart its economy with development projects for growth and jobs, to give adequate funding, stop killing hopes and stop experimenting with our lives.
Yes, thank you very much. Mrs. Grosstedt. Yes, thank you very much, President. Cyprus, the little Switzerland in the Mediterranean, is sinking, and its prosperity lay in its banks. But Cyprus, with a population similar to the city of Marseille, but with an oversized banking sector, there are very many and serious responsibilities. And people have not really been paying too close attention to the risky behaviour of the banks. So the Eurogroup, under Mr. Dijsselbloem, took certain measures. There was the taxation of the more modest Cypriots. That cannot be the solution. What about the trust and confidence of the savers? And we have to be very careful that we're not creating a precedent, because that would be of concern to all Europeans. Cyprus, its people are suffering. But we know that there are very promising economic perspectives in Cyprus. We know that Cyprus is facing a problem in how to overcome the partition of the island, but there is the Greek part of the island who since 1974 has been deprived of its agriculture and industry, and they've had to build up their industry on the basis of finance and banks. So all of us are responsible. Also, our Parliament as well, their Parliament, in order to not try and solve the problem and reply to the concerns of the Cypriots. In order to get out of this crisis, Cyprus is going to have to rekindle growth, but there's the expoliation of innocent savers. That is not a measure that is going to allow them to exit this crisis with their heads held high. Thank you very much, and I'd now like to hand the floor to Mrs. Kleva.
If 5 years ago somebody told us that Europe would be saving a crisis in an ad hoc and non-democratic and non-transparent method, everybody would object. Today, this is a reality, and Troika, Eurogroup are dangerously dictating the future architecture of the European Union without taking any democratic accountability. There are many decisions that were taken to resolve the Cyprus, and the domino effect followed, which also hurt Slovenia. Therefore, it is key that speculations on which country is to follow should stop as early as possible. Slovenia needs reform. This is what we are aware of, and we are working on it. Proposals, coordinations and orientations by renowned institutions are very much welcome, but this all has to be based on facts rather than speculations. Macroeconomic indicators of Slovenia today are very clear. Public finance debt, the unemployment level, and also the private debt are below the European average. These are the facts. Thank you.
Mr. Stolojan.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Cipru are nevoie.
Thank you very much, President. Cyprus needs all the support that we can possibly give it. It needs the support of the EU in particular. I'd like to thank the Commissioner, Mr. Rehn, and the Commission for all efforts deployed to date. Also, I think it is the intention of the Commission to accelerate the use of funds for Cyprus, and I think that this is a step in the right direction. That said, I would also like to take this opportunity to deplore any delays. For instance, the slow pace at which decisions were taken for Cyprus, notwithstanding the signals that were coming out for quite some time before that. It seems to me that the ECB should explain itself before this House. And I would take this opportunity to ask the European Commission to please deploy all necessary efforts in order to make sure that all member states can accept a system of automatic exchange of information concerning deposits and savings in banks that are situated in the member states of the European Union. We can't just sit and wait. We can't either stand by and watch tax evasion.
Madame Toia.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you. The damage caused to the credibility and trust of Europe by the disastrous management of the Cypriot crisis was going to last for a long time. We are going to stir up the anti-European organisations, and indeed many, even the European institutions like the Commission and Council, have not done what was needed. They made things worse. So what we don't see as any real policies, any real proposals for change. I'd like to mention two. One mentioned by Mr. Svoboda, the leader of my group. We need more democracy, we need more legitimacy. Especially the Troika. It's an embarrassing sort of organisation. One representative of a European institution, the Commission, that Parliament can speak to, but the other two are members, indeed employees, of international financial organisations with no resources of their own. That's completely unacceptable. So we are getting into...
Herzlichen Dank.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments. The Council President in office has asked to be able to give her conclusions to this point, whether that would be possible. So I'd now like to hand the floor to Mrs. Creighton.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I'd like to thank the House for your indulgence. I have to accompany my President to a meeting with your President in a couple of minutes, so that's why I've asked to take the floor slightly early. I do think that, however, that I have a very good sense of the broad spectrum of views here in the Chamber, and I think I can draw possibly two very strong messages. One, I think, is the very clear need to proceed with the commitment of last June's Council to break the link between bank debt and sovereign debt. And secondly, I think to continue with our resolve to implement our commitments in respect of banking union. From our point of view as Irish Presidency, and obviously I am speaking on behalf of the Council, but I think it is fair to say also as an Irish Minister, having experienced our own involvement with the Troika in the last number of years, I think it is absolutely essential that we now press ahead with the banking union's other proposed elements, such as the recovery and resolution mechanism for banks, a Europe-wide resolution fund and the joint deposit guarantee scheme. And we need to accelerate that process, and certainly from our point of view we stand ready to cooperate and work intensively with the European Parliament on these proposals during the remainder of our presidency. These measures are quite clearly absolutely essential to ensure the long-term stability of our financial sector, which is of course a prerequisite for growth and which in turn is a prerequisite for job creation. Clearly there are no easy solutions to the current crisis, but there are very logical steps that we can take and indeed that we must take in order to rebuild the European economy, and I think that is our common cause and that is our joint agenda. So I look forward very much to working with colleagues from the European Parliament towards this objective, well beyond the Irish Presidency of the European Union, into the future. And again, President, I would like to thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to conclude slightly early. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to thank you, Madam. And perhaps I could now hand the floor to Mr. Rangel. Yes, thank you, President. Thank you. I would just like to highlight one fact, and that is that if we take a look at the crisis in the Eurozone and the banking crisis, there's no simple solution. If we take a look at the Eurogroup and the various governments of the member states of the European Union and the institutions, all together they're going to have to fine-tune the criteria. Having said that, if we take a look at what has happened in Cyprus, I think this constitutes a monumental error and seems to be going back on what we are doing. So rather than making headway in trying to come up with a solution, in trying to facilitate a solution, I think we are regressing. And obviously this has consequences and impact for Cyprus, but not only, it also will have an impact on other countries. And I think it will also mean that there are consequences for the possibility to adjust and readapt. And obviously this is of importance both for the Commission and the Eurogroup as well. It's essential that we come up with a European solution to those countries that are having to adapt, because I don't think we can have a solution unless it's general. Thank you. Mr. López Aguilar.
Thank you very much, President. Cyprus is a matter of concern, as is recovery, but this whole episode will have an impact, and it will have an impact on the whole of the European Union. And this has been seen as a disaster, really, for our institutions. First of all, because we're not abiding by our own rules. Savers are being penalised. And secondly, we're also creating the impression that this was done in haste, that it was not properly thought through. Communication, therefore, has been a disaster, an unmitigated disaster. Now, people are afraid that this will constitute a precedent and people don't feel safe anymore. We've also looked at the risk premium for countries. We've seen an increase in that premium, and in a way that makes it even more difficult to handle our debt. Now, the ministers who gather for ECOFIN and the Eurogroup, I think that in a way, really, we should see a change in that composition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Giannakou.
Chairman, the situation in the European Union is known now, in the Council, in the Parliament and the Commission. The solution selected for Cyprus was an experiment. This experiment created doubts in depositors in the whole of Europe. They had doubts whether their savings were safe. They have misgivings, they're worrying. They suspect that if this happened in another country, a larger country or another country, this solution would not have been chosen. This solution was the wrong solution and destructive. Of course, it was accepted by need by the leadership of Cyprus. Substantially, however, you punished a new leadership. The leadership had just been elected, and you undermined its future. And this should become a lesson. Either we can face the crisis altogether, because the problem is a spherical problem, because we have a global competition, either we cannot. Either we implement our decisions or we do not, and we change our decision. We have to choose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Troutman.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. The situation in Cyprus has exacerbated the debate on the legitimacy of decisions by the Troika, but it does force us to see that, we're just ineffective. The three institutions, the ECB, the IMF and the Commission involved in the countries in difficulty, do they have the right to impose these austerity measures that weigh so heavily on the citizens and make social injustice worse? And in Cyprus, they initially refused to even rule out the small savers. Purely economic reasons behind this being validated in this no idea of solidarity. The Cypriot economic model was not sustainable, but the initial proposals without the Parliament's approval could only make it worse and throttle the population. Today the big question is growth for the people of Cyprus and for the European Union. It is the fight to get rid of tax havens and to have tax justice. That's for our credibility and legitimacy.
Mrs. Polimata.
Thank you. We have two problems concerning the decisions taken by the Eurogroup for Cyprus. The first concerns the democratic control and transparency. Many speakers have mentioned that. The second problem concerns something that I raised to you, Mr. Rehn and Mr. Barnier, in a letter I sent a few days ago. It concerns the dangers created from this case experimental, case-by-case implementation of the bail-in, and experimental. It's correct for the private sector to participate to the cost of the bailout of banks, but bail-in is a tool, the last resort, in the framework of the cohesive and a total framework of a resolution of the banking sector. If it's implemented at a flat rate, it creates larger problems than the ones it tries to resolve. And I would like to ask you, Vice President Rehn, what are you going to do in order to avoid the increase of the uncertainty in the countries that are facing economic problems and countries that need of trust in the financial sector? Thank you.
Danke. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This now brings us on to the Catch the Eye procedure. Because we are under pressure of time, I can only take four members, and I do apologise to everybody else and crave your understanding. Mr. Mitsoudidis.
Herr Pizzilidis.
Περισσότερη Ευρώπη είναι η λύση.
More Europe is the solution, Chairman. An integrated is a solution of the European Union. This solution to face the problem of Cyprus. We want a Europe of solidarity, not a Europe of competition. For this economic crisis that did not influence only Cyprus, we have responsibilities in Cyprus and the Cyprus bankers, but also the European authorities in our country. But for these mistakes, the Cypriot citizens are not responsible, who are paying the cost. They were expecting more community solidarity instead of the bankruptcy that they're going through. I'm wondering, which bankruptcy is more dangerous? The bankruptcy of Cyprus and the population of Cyprus, or of European solidarity? If, in spite of the feeling of injustice felt by the Cypriot people, Cyprus will not leave Europe, but is going to fight in Europe, struggle to make Europe better.
Mrs. Gomez.
Madame Gomez.
Mrs. Gomez.
Cyprus, the Eurogroup split the euro. Euro deposits there are worth less than 60% of similar amounts deposited in Germany. Don't tell us that all was done to fight tax evasion. Solution 1 imploded the European deposit guarantee and fell on small depositors to actually allow the money laundering business to go on. And Solution 2, when it came, had given enough time to most criminals to organise capital flight. Don't tell us that all now is being done to accelerate the banking union. Why don't you, Commissioner, denounce the German government, who is actively slowing it down to suit its own electoral calendar? Commissioner Rehn, Commission, assume your responsibility. Stop hiding behind the Troika. If you want to move against tax evasion and impose fiscal responsibility, why didn't you lift a finger to stop capital flight from my country, Portugal, instead of letting the Troika bless a tax amnesty for tax evaders and other criminals under the...
Frau Kollegin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Katzimakakis.
Herr Präsident, when I entered politics, one of my biggest idols, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, defined as one of the cornerstones of the European Union the respect of the right and the sovereignty, especially of the small members of the European Union. The Eurogroup did not respect this small member state, Cyprus, and its sovereignty, not the economy and not the society of Cyprus. The Eurogroup should stop to put in danger this fundamental value of the European Union, respecting the sovereignty of the small. And that is why we should respect Cyprus in order to safeguard the European Union. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, dear colleague. So the last, under the Catch the Eye procedure, is Chrysochelos.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a fact that there are responsibilities, because for such a long time the problems were not spotted in the Cypriot banking sector and they were not resolved. And on the other hand, case-by-case decisions were taken without any plan. And this leads in changes that take place into one night. And big changes for society. You cannot do things like that in policies. Sudden moves were made by the Cypriot government and the Eurogroup. They could have, with European solidarity and with just taxation, measures implemented. The banking sector should be the find solution for banking solution long term to address the problem of tax avoidance. And the Cypriot society needs the solidarity of Europe, needs capital from Europe, with a plan that has specific targets, long-term plans, and you need also a dialogue with society in Cyprus to implement the plans. And we have to help the two communities in Cyprus to reunite and to avoid this division, to stop this division of the island.
Right, now the Commission, represented by Commissioner Olli Rehn and Mr. Barnier, they will share the speaking time. Commissioner Olli Rehn has the floor.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, let me first of all thank you for a very substantive and serious debate and your often very critical remarks. I listened to you very carefully, and I can assure you that the Commission will take into account this very critical debate. I will make only some very short comments now, and my colleague Mr. Barnier will on his part continue on some important issues. Concerning first the specific nature of the Cyprus package, which has been referred to in many discussions, many interventions in the discussion. The Cypriot agreement consists of an economic stabilisation programme which is grounded on financial sector conditionality, the strengthening of banks' capital buffers, the improvement of their liquidity condition, the enhancement of prudential regulation and of supervision are elements that have been common to all programme countries. The bail-in of creditors is in fact less of a novelty than it might appear. After all, the Irish programme also included very strong own contributions by bank creditors. More than €5 billion of subordinated junior debt was bailed in Ireland. At the same time, the Pension Reserve Fund of Ireland contributed close to €10 billion. The specificity of the Cypriot case is that, given the heavy reliance of Cypriot banks on deposits, standard creditor contributions could only deliver a part of the needed funds. The bailing in of uninsured deposits was a consequence of this. Given the unique nature of the Cypriot case, the approach followed in Cyprus should not be seen as a blueprint for any possible future activities. Indeed, there are no templates as such. While each programme may have its similarities, each is tailored to the needs of the country in question. Greece, Ireland, Portugal and Spain have all had very clear specific conditions which have been taken into account in the programme design. Mr. Lamberts referred to the programme cost, and I think it is a very important question he referred to. The confusion is coming from the fact that two entirely different sets of figures are being compared, one net, the other gross, one based on a set of assumptions from several months ago, while the other taking into account the most recent decisions and the most recent macroeconomic projections. In other words, in the public debate, in the media, people have been comparing apples with pears and coming up with oranges, frankly. I refrain from remarking that this is what happens when stories are written based on leaked documents. But if you look at these two figures of 17 billion and 23 billion to which Mr. Lamberts referred to, the difference is that the 17 billion is related to net financing needs, while the larger figure that has been floated, 23 billion, is a cross-financing concept. And moreover, the larger number also includes additional buffers in the second Cypriot programme. The combined contribution to the programme from the ESM and IMF remains 10 billion euros, and there is thus no change in the financial envelope available for Cyprus. Let me conclude by saying that the Commission urged Cyprus to take timely action already in November 2011 and worked tirelessly to reach a quick agreement on a programme in the past 1 year. Unfortunately, this proved to be impossible. Within the constraints handed to us, the room of manoeuvre was very limited, and not to reach an agreement at all would have been the worst for all. And in this regard, I think what Mr. Swoboda, Mr. Verhofstadt and Mr. Cohn-Bendit said about the cumbersome and complex structure of decision-making within the Eurozone is very important. And indeed, we need to together continue to intensify the reform of the Eurozone in order to rebuild our economic and monetary union to be up to its task. It's clear that the near future will be difficult for the Cypriot people.
Herr Kommissar, darf ich?
Commissioner, excuse me. Could I please ask everyone to please take their seats, stop chatting on the sidelines and listen please to the two commissioners. Thank you.
And I'm very much looking forward to continue this discussion in the hearing of the Econ Committee on the 25th of April. I just want to say that the Commission will do everything possible to alleviate the social consequences and mitigate the impact on the most vulnerable to the society, and we will stand by the Cypriot people in these difficult times. Thank you.
Herr Kommissar Olli Rehn.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner Rehn. Commissioner Barnier has asked for the floor. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, in all of these crises, Cyprus that we were discussing this morning and all the others, there are always two periods of action. Firstly, urgency, reparation, surgery, if I can use that word. And allow me to reassure you, we know what effort is required of the European peoples in Brussels. And then there's another stage, that is the preventive stage and the lessons that have to be learned. And it's not only my work and the proposals that I make that take place then, it's also your action which is in that stage. Cyprus is certainly not a model, but in Cyprus, as in the other crises, there are lessons to be learned. And we will learn them one by one, week by week. We've been doing that together for the past 3 years. Poor supervision. We set up we talked about the European supervisory bodies, and next year we hope that there will be integrated supervision in the Eurozone with the European Central Bank. Poor capitalisation of banks, unjustified and ridiculous bonuses which give rise to risks as well. You responded to that on the basis of the report from Otmar Karas. 608 of you yesterday voted in favour of a crucial text which will support the robust nature of the banks. And also instruments well announced in advance for adjustment, bailing, a full toolbox Over a year ago, I presented to you the text which is currently being discussed, and in June I will put to you the setting up of the European Resolution Fund. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Commission will not accept that people tell us we are not reacting, we're not learning lessons. It is true, however, that we have to move faster, and we really have to push this reform right through to the very end as quickly as possible. For that purpose, the Commission and the Commissioner speaking must continue to be able to base themselves on your support. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Grazie,
Dziękuję bardzo.
Buongiorno a tutti, iniziamo le votazioni, saranno votazioni lunghe, però con calma ce la possiamo fare. Iniziamo con